So I put some Helio Gazer yeast and Phantasm Powder to the test. Can these items help me make my best New England IPA ever? Well, I don't know if that was the case, but I did make a great looking beer that's got a lot of interesting flavors. Well, stick around and see how I made this beer. Well, I really appreciate you stopping by Cascade's Homebrew today. So my name is Brent. So I live here in Northern Virginia. I'm lucky enough that I have several homebrew clubs in the area, and I attend a couple of them. So I'm president of a club called the Warthogs. I also attend meetings of Nova Homebrew and also Howl, Homebrewers of Western Loudoun. I got this shirt recently. Let's check out the back. So luckily for me, Homebrewers of Western Loudoun tend to meet more in central Loudoun County, which is a little closer to where I live. So Howl puts on one of my favorite homebrewing club events. We do a white elephant exchange. In this case, it's for homebrewing ingredients. So if you're not really familiar with a white elephant, the basics are everybody brings one item wrapped up so you can't see what it is. You draw numbers to determine an order. And then when it's your turn to pick, you can either pick an unopened gift or you can steal something that somebody else has opened. So then you kind of know what they have, or you can go for a random item. So in the case of the Howl exchange, the item expected to be something you can use to make a beer. Often it's something maybe a little unique. This year I brought a bag of pecans, but I came home with a Helio Gazer pack of yeast and also a 1 ounce pack of Phantasm Powder. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about thiols. Okay, so I'm going to admit, I'm not the expert in thiols. If you want the expert, you got to look for somebody like Scott Janish. There's also some pretty good other videos and articles talking about thiols and their impact on beer. So basically, thiols are one of the characters of hops, say like a Citra and a Mosaic, that gives some of that tropical fruit flavor. They're also very popular in some of like the New Zealand, Australian type hops. A lot of the newer hops, some of that fruit, tropical fruit aroma, well that's a thiol. So those hops are called free thiols. That means the thiol's in a state where you can smell and taste it. Thiols also exist in what they call a bound state. In that state we can't really experience the flavor. So some hops, like Cascade and Zotz, those ones are high in those bound thiols, but they don't have a lot of the free thiols. Another source of bound thiols is in grain, in your lightly kilned base malt, say like a Pilsner malt. So that is where my gift exchange items come in. So Helio Gazer is a genetically modified yeast that's engineered to release those bound thiols. I'm not quite sure what my feelings are on GMO yeast, especially just for something like brewing. And then the Phantasm Powder is made from dried Sauvignon Blanc grapes. Supposedly it has also a lot of those bound thiols, or those thiol precursors. So the research that I did on thiols and some of these thiol yeasts, that kind of drove some of my decisions for my recipe. First off, I needed kind of something I could turn around. I had about 3 weeks from brew day before I wanted to be serving this at the Howl meeting. So I decided to kind of pull back the ABV and the gravity a little bit from what I do maybe from a typical, say, New England IPA. So it's targeting original gravity around 1060, give me an ABV somewhere around 6%. So it's still pretty up there, kind of on the edge between, say, a pale ale and IPA is in my mind. So I mentioned Cascade hops as one that's got a lot of those bound thiols. So I decided to use Cascade. One, because I had a bunch of Cascade in the fridge, and two, the channel name is Cascade's Homebrew after all. So the thing is, the Cascade hops, they go into the mash. I know that sounds a little weird. Well, word on the street is that maybe the enzymes in the mash, they do something that kind of make those bound thiols available for the yeast. Well, I don't know, you'd have to read up more on that. But basically the idea is you'd add a hop like that into the mash so that it would be ready for the yeast to convert into thiols. So that's what I did. I trust the experts. I added 4 ounces or 113 grams of Cascade into the mash. So for the other hops in this one, I went for a combination of Centennial and Citra hops. I also kind of pulled back the amount than what I would do for maybe a typical New England IPA. So basic idea, these are some hops that I knew well. I'd be able to identify in a beer. And I kind of pulling back the amount, so I didn't really want them to clobber the thiols. I really wanted the thiols to be able to shine, and maybe if there's an impact, say from the Phantasm Powder. Alright, let's do a quick overview of the recipe in the brew day. Hey, when we get to that tasting, tell that guy to get a haircut. So there wasn't too much special about the brew day, but I was outside brewing on my 5-gallon batch on my brew in the bag propane burner setup, using this 15-gallon kettle. When the weather cooperates, and I have time, I do enjoy brewing outside, though I do also enjoy brewing smaller batches in my stovetop. This one is my creatively named Helio Gazer Hazy. So it's basically a hazy IPA on the lower ABV side, going for a 5.5 gallons in the fermenter, 21 liters. Bitterness on this one is a moderate 27.5 IBUs with a light color. I targeted the recipe around a 75% efficiency, which would give me an original gravity of 1060, final gravity 1015, with a 5.9% ABV. Now this is a style where the water profile, it could be important. So the typical idea with a lot of these hazy IPAs, New England IPAs, is to kind of increase the chloride, give you a little bit of kind of roundness, a little bit of mouthfeel to them. So in this case, boosting the chloride up to about 150, sulfate around 50, so give me about a 3-to-1 ratio. And doing that also boosted my calcium up just over 100. The other amounts are what's in my tap water. So I calculated I need 7.7 gallons, or about 29 liters of water. To that, I had 2.1 milliliters of lactic acid, targeting a pH around 5.4. I had a little bit of gypsum, so 1 gram, but also a pretty good amount of calcium chloride, 7 grams, and also tablet of Campton to remove chlorine and chloramines from my tap water. So the grain bill for this one follows a pattern that I've used for other hazy IPAs. So around 71% of an American 2-row, so that would be 8.5 pounds or 3.9 kilograms. And then I have the same amount, 12.5% of flaked oats and also white wheat malt. So that's 1.5 pounds or 680 grams. And then I have 4.2% of a dark Munich malt, around 10 Levabond. That's half a pound or 227 grams. So I find the Munich malt gives just a little bit kind of that bright yellow character without pushing it into sort of brown and murky looking. And as I mentioned, I had 4 ounces or 113 grams of Cascade into the mash. It seemed like kind of an odd addition, but hey, gotta trust the experts. I then mashed it for 60 minutes with a target of 152 or about 67 degrees Celsius. At the end of the 60-minute mash, I pulled out the grain bag to drain it. I also gave it a little bit of a squeeze to get a little extra of those sugars. The 30-minute boil on this one was uneventful enough that I guess I didn't film any clips of it. Nothing was even added to the boil. The Cascade hops in the mash, they contribute enough of bitterness for the style. I also added some yeast nutrient to the starter. I'm not sure if I'd be adding clarifier like a Werflock tablet into the boil for this style. It's supposed to be hazy. I didn't add one for this batch. I have added them to some other batches. I'm not sure if it makes much impact. At the end of the boil, I used my immersion chiller to reduce the wort temperature down to my target steep temperature of 107 degrees Fahrenheit or 77 degrees Celsius. Once I reached that temperature, I went in and added my steep hops. It's 2 ounces each or 57 grams of Centennial and Citra. I let these steep for about 20 minutes. And then I chilled the wort down to my pitching temperatures. I only had the 1 ounce pack of Phantasm Powder. The pitch rate says 1 to 4 ounces for a 5-gallon batch, so I decided it'd be interesting to split this one in half and add the Phantasm Powder into one of the fermenters. I had seen some mentions of adding Phantasm into the fermenter. Most of the time I see it's added into the hot whirlpool. I decided just adding to the fermenter was the easiest path for me. I'm not sure if I've shown it before on video, but I found this nice tea. It's got a 1/2-inch barb on the top that feeds into 2 3/8-inch barbs on the sides. This looks real good for splitting up the wort stream into my 2 fermenters. So I was not sure if making a starter with a Helio Gazer was needed, but I went ahead and did one anyways. I always think it's a good idea, in case. Then I split the yeast from the starter into each batch. I did save a little bit in case I wanted to use it for a future batch. So one of the fermenters got the 1/2 ounce or 28 grams of Phantasm Powder. Like I said, I'm not sure if adding it directly to wort is recommended, but that was my process. I couldn't help but wonder at this point, did I just add a $5 package of dirt to my beer? So I measured an original gravity of 1057, with just a touch under my target of 1060. Then I moved both fermenters into my chamber, where I started off fermentation at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 17 degrees Celsius. Here we are checking back in on day 2, and oh boy, I'm sure glad I made that yeast starter. Oh, the yeast was sure a thick, goopy mess to clean up, but I guess that's a good sign that the yeast was happy. So after fermentation was done, it's time to dry hop. So I split the dry hops between the fermenters with a total, again, same amount they added to the whirlpool, 2 ounces or 57 grams each of Centennial and Citra. So that was 2 ounces of the mix into each fermenter. After 2 days of dry hopping, I went ahead and cold crashed the beer, and then I kegged these beers in the middle of a double brew day. Well, I needed the fermenters for 2 porters I was brewing. Those are ones that I'm targeting for the National Homebrew Competition. Wish me luck. So the key stats on this one is my efficiency, just a touch under my target, around 71%, gave me an original gravity of 1057. Attenuation was just a little bit higher than was predicted, so my final gravity was 1012, which gave me an ABV of 6.0%. So it's a Friday night, and I wanted to drink some beer. I wanted to share my experience with Helio Gazer with you. So hopefully future me has talked to you a little bit about the recipe, showed you a little bit how I brewed it. So I really wanted to get to these beers. One, while they're kind of fresh, and two, I knew the kegs was getting low, especially one of them, and I was right. So I went to pour them. I only got this much out of the one that's got the Phantasm powder, but that's enough. We got enough to taste. So I want to focus mostly on the Helio Gazer yeast, and also, are there any differences with the Phantasm powder? Is it worth using? Well, if we go in for appearance, if we definitely look at this one, it's a very nice hazy beer. I've noticed the one with the Phantasm powder was starting to drop a little bit clear. I'm not quite sure the cause of that. It could be that the powder, when it was added into the fermenter, maybe caused some stuff to pull out. So it could have been added in the Phantasm powder, like just sprinkling it directly into the fermenter was a bad idea. I think most times people say to put it in the whirlpool when it's hot. In my case, since I was trying to do the split batch, it was a lot easier for me just to add it directly into the fermenter. So I might recommend, if you're using Phantasm powder, well, I might recommend you don't use Phantasm powder. We'll get to that later. But I would recommend probably adding it into the hot side, into the whirlpool, or at least before into the wort before you add it in the fermenter. So maybe it dissolves. I don't know. It's kind of a weird powder. But we look at the appearance. The base beer is an incredibly nice beer. Kind of the base I've been going with lately for a hazy is a 2-row base, and then using some flaked oats and then malted wheat, and then also using either some Vienna or some Munich just to add a little bit of kind of that nice yellow orange color, and then also a little bit of grain complexity. Trying to avoid like crystal malts, because I found, at least with using like Verdant and some of the other yeast, they just came across a little bit too sweet. So I think the appearance on this one is nice. Hopefully it's coming across. Definitely, I took some pictures out in the sunlight, and it was a really pretty looking beer. So if we go for aroma, is there a difference on them? So one thing I'd say, so right now these beers have been in the keg for 4 weeks. I've done a couple different side-by-side tastings to see which I could identify them. I kind of think the Phantasm one had a little bit more of that kind of thiol character, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit. But they're really subtle, and I had a hard time picking them out. When I was tasting them blind, I was probably about 2/3 of the time getting the correct one that was Phantasm, but not enough that it really stood out is kind of remarkable. But if we go in for aroma, they're both very similar. They have that thiol character, which is a little bit hard to describe. I mean, given that these are just Citra and Centennial hops, they don't taste like a Citra Centennial beer. It really kind of tastes like a beer that's got like a lot of those like New Zealand hops, say like the Nelson Sauvin in there. So what aroma do I get? I definitely get something I'd say maybe tropical, definitely a little bit of that sort of passion fruit, the kind of sweet passion fruit type character. That would be kind of the predominant aroma. Definitely that I can say that's the thiol character. I think it's really boosting those thiols up there. So I can see. So one of the descriptions with thiol, if it gets to a high level, is sort of this body odor. And it sounds bad, but maybe in a good way. I could definitely see the sort of pleasant body odor aroma, if that makes sense. Definitely that sort of yeast-driven thiols is really kind of what dominates this beer. And like I say, it's very similar in both classes, both types, either with the Phantasm powder or without it. All right, let's go in for taste, mouthfeel. So there's a lot of really good things about this beer. I think the flavor of the malt bill is really good. The one thing I would say, it comes across maybe as a little bitter. So I think adding that amount of Cascade into the mash hop probably did add a reasonable amount of bitterness. And there weren't any other hops in the boil, just Whirlpool and dry hop. But there's definitely a little bit of a bitterness component to this. And it could be just maybe a little bit of the lower gravity. It doesn't provide the sweetness that I typically like in these kind of beers. I think this was like 1060, where I'm usually kind of pushing like 1070. So it could also be yeast driven. Maybe that the Helio Gazer just doesn't leave behind as much sweetness as the Verdant that I've been using quite a bit lately. So what about like the hoppy and thiol character of the beer? So I cut back a little bit on kind of the hop additions, both the Whirlpool, the dry hop, from what maybe I would do from a bigger, higher gravity New England IPA. So what I've read is like heavy dry hopping could potentially pull out the thiols. And I really wanted this one to showcase the Helio Gazer, especially because it was the club event where we share the Helio Gazer and the Phantasm powder. And part of that event, it really is to kind of showcase the ingredient that you got from the exchange. So I really wanted that, and I think it did that. So in some ways there's part of this beer that's almost really incredible. But I think it's maybe just a little bit out of balance. Like there's just not enough kind of backbone traditional hop character in there. And there's a lot of this sort of maybe one note thiol that's just kind of, you know, maybe like an artificial kind of thiol kind of character that kind of stands out. But like I said, I think it's really close to being one of the best hazies I've ever made. But I think I just need to bring it in balance. So my take would be, you know, maybe just get rid of the mash hops. Like I think there's enough thiol character. And the things I've seen people using some of those thiol enhancing is they get quite a bit of that kind of thiol character that gets generated, whether it's just from the grain or the hops that are in there. So I might just pull out the mash hops or at least scale them down quite a bit. So I'm kind of curious if it was a higher gravity beer that had just a little bit more sort of malt backbone, maybe it would blend in a little better. So that's something I'm interested in trying. I haven't talked a lot about the one with the Phantasm Powder in there. Like I said, I think it had a little bit more of that thiol character that kind of boosts that passion fruity kind of character. I think maybe as it's settled, it's actually kind of subdued, that now maybe the one without the Phantasm Powder has a little bit more flavor. It could just be the visual that I see that it's more clear, so it kind of registers to me that there's less flavor in there. So my question would be, you know, is it worth using the Phantasm? So I have this 1 ounce pack that somebody bought at the local store. So this one was $5 an ounce. From what I read, you want, let's say, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 ounces in a 5-gallon batch. So that would be a lot of money. So at this point, $5 an ounce, we're talking high-end hops. You can get it cheaper in bulk, but you also get hops cheaper in bulk too. So for me, I just don't see the money spending the premium on something like this. It only has a subtle character. I think you could just buy some more premium hops and use those. But if this was like a bulk thing where you bought it for like, you know, $4 or $5 for a pound, hey, I would say go ahead. But when it costs more than good quality hops, I just don't see the value. So that would be the changes I would have for the recipe. 1, cut back on the mash hops. 2, get rid of the Phantasm. Don't worry about that. The other thing, you know, maybe do something to kind of boost up the maltiness of the beer. That would be either like raising the gravity or, you know, maybe adding in like some golden naked oats or some honey malt to kind of boost a little bit of sweetness. You know, maybe changing the mash temperature. I don't think mash really has that much impact on the overall sweetness of a beer, but you can use mash to kind of control the ABV and then the OG, and kind of tune it where you want. So as far as the Helio Gazer, so I saved off some of the starter. I have some that I could use again. I'm a little bit curious about trying it. On the other hand, I've got lots of other things I want to brew too. And also just other New England IPA type things I want to play with. So maybe I'll try a cycle back in, try to do something a little better with Helio Gazer. What about you? What hop combos have you found that work better with Helio Gazer? Or what about, say, like the Lunar Crush, which I think is their lager one, or the Cosmic Punch, which is a less aggressive thiol one that's kind of based on the London Ale 3, just like Helio Gazer is. So what luck have you had with thiol releasing yeast? What kind of hop combos have you found that work well with them? I'd love to hear from you, so make sure you leave a comment. And hopefully you learned something from this today. And have a great one. Cheers!